All right, everybody. Great to have you all back. And this is the third of three. And Bert has already put in a request to do another series. So we will definitely, I'm definitely open to that. And we'll look about that into that sometime in the future. But what we're going to do now is we are going to focus
Wait
our.
1 second, Rabbi Linzer. Before we do that, Judy, do you want to dedicate the learning for Refuah Shalema for some of your friends? You got to unmute. Judy, you need to unmute if you want to do that. You still mute. Oh,
Can you hear
there
me
we
now?
go, Judy.
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, great. I'd like to also dedicate it for the refuah shlema of my granddaughter. She had a little challenging thing with bad weather with the air. She has a problem with asthma. Her name is Sarah Shana Bat Yochana Brina. And my friends are the following. Sarah Bat Chana Rachel, Bracha Zahava Bat Chana Rachel, Nava Bat Yehudit, Nachama Bat Frida, and my sister Esther Bat Sarah.
Amen. Amen. They should have a first lema.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we are going to focus on the this will be focusing on the practice of Maaser Ksafim, of tithing income, and we were I'll catch up us very quickly on what we did last time, and in terms of seeing like where this derived from and the nature of the practice. And what we're going to focus on in this conversation, in this class, is going to be some of the very practical questions that people have asked and how that really plays out in practice. So I'm going to share my screen and first remind us of where we left off last time. So, okay, that's the source sheet, but let me open my notes. I'm sure that Bert sent everybody the notes. So last time we looked at some models in the Torah of various things that would fall under the rubric of tzedakah. The ones that are in the blue are those that are sort of directed towards the poor. The ones that are in the green are those that are more directed towards the Kohanim, like Kohanim or Levi'im in the sense of their religious service and their religious work. And we also spoke about a model that was not directly, conceptually, not directly towards these people are our religious leaders, or these are religious institutions and we should give to them, but more is we should give back to God. And now, the first sense is like, God has given me this, blessed me with wealth or with anything that I have from God. How do I give back? I want to give back to God. And the way I give back to God is either through the most intuitive thing would be to some religious institution or, religious representative like Avraham and Melchizedek. It could also be seen as giving to the poor in the sense of doing God's work of taking care of the poor. But that is one that most is conflated with this idea of, giving to religious institutions, but it's a little bit conceptually different. So in terms of Maaser Ksafim now, so that was like in the Torah what we have, but those were limited to mostly agricultural, and giving of money was really in the Torah a focus on lending money. We didn't do that shear, but I told you that. In the time of the rabbis, particularly, it evolved into a mitzvah of straight tzedakah. But even that was limited to when a poor person comes and asks. So that does not translate into a regular giving. And the tithing and all the agricultural gifts became pretty much moot after we were no longer an agricultural society and no longer living in Israel. So that then, what we find by the time you get to medieval Ashkenaz in the 13th century, and maybe it started a little bit earlier, but certainly in the 13th century, is already an established practice of tithing one's income. And in the Torah, of course, we see that goes back to Avraham and to Yaakov. And again, there the framing very much like Yaakov says, Aser asrenu lach, whatever you, God, give me, I will give a tenth back to you. But that doesn't create an obligation. That's just, it shows how that is a very fundamental practice of a religious person who recognizes that what they have comes from God, and and that's fine. Like that could be an important model for us all to learn from. Not everything has to become formal halacha. That is a very ancient, well-established practice, already established by Avraham and Yaakov, and that's what you do, is you give a tenth back to God. In the time of Ashkenaz, as we said, we find that it had become somewhat of a established norm, and then the question becomes, what is the basis for it? Tosfos cites an early, a misattributed source, misattributed to an early source, trying to link it to the idea of tithing of Maaser in the Torah, but it was clearly a medieval source that had been misattributed, because it spoke about giving a tithe from your rebate, from your, from the money you get from lending loans to non-Jews and you get interest from, which was clearly a medieval phenomenon. Okay, but it's an attempt to attribute it back to the Torah obligation. And we ended by looking at the Maharami Rutenberg. We'll look at that again because we did that a little quickly, who made it clear that this was a practice. It was a minhag. And that's the most honest, historical assessment of it. Nowhere in the Gemara does it talk about an idea of Meiser Ksafim. Nowhere in the earlier sources. We clearly have a model for it in the Torah, and it is not at all surprising that when there was the other models sort of broke down, the other obligations, I should say, stopped being relevant, the agricultural mitzvot, that this model became adopted as a regular practice, at least in Ashkenaz. I can't tell you why specifically Ashkenaz, but that's certainly the reality that we find. And one final thing I'll say before, in summing up, is I don't know. It would be interested. I'm sure people who know medieval history, Ashkenaz history, know better. I'm curious about the institution of the soup kitchen, the tamchoy, that we discussed before, and how relatively practiced that was in Ashkenaz versus Sfarad, because those would still be practices that would be ongoing ways of providing for the poor, at least for the destitute. So, and I'm assuming that those continue to exist alongside Meiser Ksafim. But Meiser Ksafim was an established practice in Ashkenaz by the 13th century, and not in Sfarad. Okay, and that's where we ended. And the range of issues that were raised, which we're going to look at, hopefully all of them this time, is to what causes does this go? To the poor or to religious causes? What types of institutions? Meaning, I think people were asked, I forget exactly, I know what types of poor, both of those I think were questions about, like Orthodox, not Orthodox, Jewish poor, not Jewish poor. How do you compute it? Your gross income, your net income? Can you count things like day school tuition and shul dues? Because that's already how we support our religious institution. Can those count towards it or not? Those are all a range of practical questions.
Can I ask you a question, Rabbi Linzer, please?
Yes.
Yeah, question. From what I understood from what you said in this past short introduction, did you not mention, or maybe I didn't understand it correctly and I need clarification, that the original Maaser during the times of Ashkenaz in the 13th century was from 1/10 of the profit that you made if you lent money to a non-Jew? Now, if I understand that correctly, I have the whole question about lending money with interest to anybody.
Right. So I didn't mean exclusively. A source that Tosfos cites speaks about, says you should give a tithe from all of your income, whether it's from business like trade, buying and selling, or whether it's from lending, interest that you get from lending to a non-Jew. All of your income. It was not limited to the case of interest, but it identified that. And yes, Jews are not allowed to lend interest to their fellow Jews. Interestingly, in the church, adopted the same practice about Christians between Christians, that Christians could not lend with interest to fellow Christians, which meant that there was a real issue for people who needed money because people didn't want to lend money if they weren't going to be able to charge interest. So the only people that the larger society could turn to for borrowing money for people who were willing to lend money were the Jews, because Jews were allowed to lend to non-Jews, but the Christians couldn't turn to their fellow Christians. And it was at a time when also Jews were being pushed out of the agricultural because the non-Jews did not want them to have any ownership of land that had too much status. They were involved in buying and trades and like in commerce, but they were also being marginalized and pushed to the edges of that as well. And the one sort of position that was left to them was money lending, and that led to all of these horrific characterizations of Jews as money grubbing and money lending and charging interest and all that stuff, and that came from a historical reality and reality that we were sort of forced into that position, in medieval Europe, and it was a necessary role. Somebody had to be lending money because you needed, economy needs there to be available funds and it needs there to be available money. So yes, that was became the major way in which, a major source of Jewish income starting in the 12th, certainly in the 13th century in Ashkenaz. And therefore it was identified as one, not the only, but as one of the things that people were giving Meiser Ksafim from. Okay.
So it's perfectly halachically okay to lend with interest to a non-Jew.
Yes, the Torah says it. It says to a foreigner you may lend, but to your brother you may not lend. Okay. Yes, that is correct. Yeah. So let us now turn back to the sources, and here we're going to look at the Maram again. He was 13th century Ashkenaz, and highly influential. And he was not, the source does not start with the question of, hey, why do we give Meiser Ksafim? What's the nature of the obligation? It starts with the question of what can that money be given towards? How can that money be used? But in the context of his discussion, he makes it clear, he says explicitly that this is a minhag. This is an established practice, but it is not some type of a formal halachic obligation. Okay, so take a look here. We'll read this again. We read it a little quickly at the end of last time. We'll read it now a little more slowly. This is source number 19. Okay, ma'ot ma'aser, when it comes to the money of Meiser Ksafim. Yiradli, it would appear to me, shehechazigu lititam la'aniyim. Once the established practice was to give to the poor, so he is acknowledged. So he starts by saying it clearly is that the practice is, what do you do with your Meiser money? You give it to the poor. And once that's true, you cannot say, I'm going to use my Meiser money for some mitzvah, for some religious purpose. Okay, because the practice has already become established that what you do with it is you give it to the poor. Why can't you do this? Gozel aniyim. Okay, it seems like you're stealing from the poor, which means that the poor, it's not halachically you're stealing from the poor. You're not obligated to give it to the poor. It's just an established practice. But once the norms of society have developed that this money is normally given to the poor, the way it will be perceived of by the poor, by others, and so on, is money that's been earmarked for the poor. You're now deciding to use it to, help build a mikveh. Okay, and that'll appear like you're stealing from the poor, and therefore you shouldn't do it. It's not proper to do it. Again, it's not a technical halachic violation, but it's clearly not proper to do it. And now he gets to the question of the nature of the obligation. In general, the afal pi she'eino min haTorah, even though it is not, the obligation of Maser is not from the Torah, ela minhag. Okay, so that's like the key line if you're asking yourself, what is the nature of the obligation, right? He says, eino min haTorah ela minhag. It's not from the Torah, it's a minhag. Nevertheless, you could say, okay, it's a minhag. So the minhag is to give it to the poor, but it's not a strict obligation. I'll give it to the mikveh. We have a principle that even if something is allowed, if there's a minhag to treat it as forbidden, you don't go ahead and sort of tell people, oh, you don't have to do it, it's just a minhag. Meaning it's a way of saying minhagim still have a binding force, even though it came from the people and not from some external, above, but nevertheless, it has a type of a binding force, okay? And the binding force is both to give it, and the practice has become to give it to the poor. So not only is it a minhag to give it, it is a minhag to give it to the poor. And that practice of giving it to the poor creates a type of de facto rights that the aniyim have to it, the poor have to it. Shekfar nagu kol hagolah, the entire exile, the entire diaspora. Okay, now entire diaspora means Ashkenazi diaspora, and again, we don't imagine that they went ahead and they hired any, survey firms to go ahead and to, and to find out all of this data and all of this information. But there's a perception that it is an extremely widespread, widely adopted practice. And you can't switch it to some other mitzvah that the aniyim are not going to benefit from. Like maybe if you wanted to go ahead and build, I don't know, a community pool for access for the poor, for people who didn't have pools in their backyard, or something like that, or a community shower facility or something, fine, you're not giving it straight to a poor person, but it is to the benefit of the poor. But something that is not that, you're not allowed to change it. So two very historically, this maram is extremely important. It acknowledges that it's widespread. It acknowledges that it's accepted to be given to the poor. And it says, as a matter of halacha, that once those two things are in place, it acknowledges that it's a minhag, that it is not something as a formal halacha, but as a minhag, it has a certain binding force. And therefore concludes that you're not allowed to change it to something else. So this is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning, but it is the sort of earliest important source in this regards. Any comments before we look on? We jump a century later here and look to Mario. Yes, Bert.
Right. That's the question. This is not probably the right time for it, is the binding status of minhag. And when does it achieve sort of like quasi-halachic status, or halachic status, and when does it, simply say, as you said, it's a minhag, but it's obligatory. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's
okay, I don't do kaparas, that's just a minhag, right? As opposed to, no, my God, it's like it's kitnias on Pesach. You're not allowed to change that. That's a minhag, right? So what types of minhagim do we think you can change and what you can't? That is a very large question that like a type of a black hole. I don't think you're ever going to find the full answer to that. But the short answer is that things that are seen as minhagim that are there to be safeguards against transgression, like kitnios would be a good example, or that are seen as something like this, as really connected to a clear mitzvah, like giving to the poor, giving tzedakah, are minhagim that are harder to change, to sort of, whereas those that are, and to sort of say, oh, it's just a minhag, where it's those that are not seen in those categories, like doing kaparas, or I don't know, doing, some people don't like do the t'nayim before the wedding. It's just an old vestige of what they used to do, when they used to have arranged marriages. Oh, it's just a minhag or something, so that's not connected to an isser, and it's not really connected to a mitzvah. So those are things that are more negotiable. That's a very simple answer. The interesting thing about Maser Ksafim is we're going to see, and this is, I appreciate you raising the meta question about minhag, is a couple of things, right? Number one is, how much does minhag get halachified? And by that I mean, if even certain minhagim that are binding, some become much more technically halachic than others. like the minhag of, I don't know, doing the t'nayim before the wedding, or doing the covering of the veil, or walking 7 times around, or whatever. All right, that's a minhag. Nobody feels like it's halacha. When you get to like the issue of kitnios, probably because it is embedded within Hilchos Pesach, and on Pesach already, there's a lot, you're not allowed to eat chametz, and there's all of these details about chametz, and then kitnios becomes like a part of the halachas of chametz. It becomes much more halachified. How can you do bittul with kitnios? What's the case about if somebody is sick, etc. And it gets much more of halachic weight than a normal minhag does. So even minhagim, it's not just a question of can they be pushed aside and said it's just a minhag, but even when we do them and do feel they're binding, there's a question about how much they take on halachic weight and how much they become halachically, like the halachic, it begins to feel like halacha in terms of the treatment of the details. And to some degree, that does have a lot to do with how much they get embedded in a pre-existing halachic system. So that's going to be a very relevant question for Meiser Ksafim. Number one question to ask is it still a widespread minhag? I think if you ask nowadays, I think maybe in like yeshivish communities or Hasidish communities, probably there is. It's a very internalized, you have to give Meiser Ksafim. They're asking halachic shailas about it. It's very much practiced. It's felt as a halachic weight. It's treated as halacha in terms of the questions around the details of it and so on. I think, and in the non-Orthodox community, we do not have internalized it the same way. People might give 10%, they might give more than 10%. But the idea of, so I'm not talking about the level of giving, but the idea of seeing like, we have a chiyuv of Meiser Ksafim, and we have to ask halachic questions about it. And, so I think there's a real question of to what degree is that true now? The widespread nature of it, the treating of it as binding, and so on. And it's going to be a question about the details, right? Can you give it to this purpose? Can you give it to that purpose? We're seeing in the Maharam that the Maharam already is taking a minhag and making it into halacha. He acknowledges it's minhag, but he says, once it's minhag, here are the halachas of the minhag. You have to give it like this. You can't give it like that. So it's a very important question you raised, Bert, about its weight and its halachic nature and its bindingness and the details and all of that. And that's what we're going to see playing out in the rest of today's shir. Lance.
Okay. Rabbi Zev Farber makes a distinction between giving to the Kohanim and giving to the poor.
We also made that distinction multiple times in the last two classes. I'm not sure what are you asking exactly?
Well, he considers giving to the Kohanim a tax.
Okay, you can send me that and I could look at that separately. I think the Levi'im could be conceptualized as a tax a little bit, but anyway, but to me, I don't like that language, tax. It's too modern and I don't think it's accurate, but however you understand it, we have discussed that idea that there's a difference between giving to the poor and when you give to the Levi'im, do you see that as a type of a payment for their work? Maybe that's what he means when he says tax, but we are supporting this type of religious service, and yes, and then in that way it would be different than giving to the poor. So that is something that we have discussed. Yes.
Rabbi Linzer?
Yes.
It's Ruby. I'm sorry, I missed previous lessons, so maybe it's already been answered, but can you qualify as a poor person if it's a temporary poverty? I mean, you're just poor because of a particular reason, but not going to be, say, 6 months from now?
Right. So that's a really good question. We did not cover that. When in the Mishnayot that discuss about the soup kitchen, they discuss that. They discuss about somebody about like, are they immediately in needs of funds? Are they in long-term needs? And that has a different question about what type of communal funds do you provide for them? So yes, that is discussed in that context. And sometimes people aren't poor, they're like, house poor, they're in a serious needs of available funds, but they do have assets, right? And that's also an important question. So that is discussed in halacha. It's not, I I would have to look at the literature in Meiser Ksafim. It's discussed very much in the context of the soup kitchen and the different types of communal funds that are provided and how do you assess different levels of poor. I'm not remembering
you
if
might
it's
have
discussed in the
agricultural
context of Meiser
poverty.
Ksafim.
You might have one season agricultural poverty,
Right.
and then have a rebound. So are you
Yes.
a poor person during that time? That's all I'm asking.
Yeah. So for somebody who's immediately in need of money is definitely in the category of poor. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look now
Can I
from.
ask another question about Linzer, please?
Yep.
Yes, question about the Maharam's approach on this. Didn't you say, or help me to understand, about having set aside money for the poor, but then you can't use it for something else? But then you were talking about setting it aside for an institution that the poor would be interested in availing themselves on, like education, whatever. Is that which? Please help clarify that.
This was from that previous source, the Maharam. He was just talking in broad strokes, but he indicated that if it were some type of a thing that was for the sake of benefiting the poor, even if it was not like direct funds to the poor, right? If it were basically like a free after school program or something like that, right? He indicated that that would count as a legitimate use of Meiser because it would be for the benefit of the poor.
Thank you.
Right? Yeah. Okay, so now let's look at this next tshuva. This is now 100 years later, 14th century, Maharil, also one of the major poskim in Ashkenaz at the time. And this also is interesting in its recognition that it's a minhag, and also the question about what the money can be used for. And also it gives us a window into some of the realities of the practice. And here's what he writes. There are many people, their poor person knocks at the door and they don't have Meiser money at the ready, okay? Because, they haven't taken off, they took their Meiser money from this last month's paycheck they've already distributed. And now there's a new poor person coming to them and they don't have any Meiser that they've taken off from, funds that are immediately available. They have to wait for the next paycheck. So what do? Malvim beinam levein atzmam, ma'ot shelahem. They extend themselves a loan. They basically say, I am going to lend $20 into my Meiser Ksafim fund. And then I am going to pay them. Imagine you've got like a pushka, as it would be. So, and you put in the pushka, you put your Meiser Ksafim each paycheck. And now your pushka's empty and a poor person is at the door. So you say, I'm going to put $20 into the pushka. That's a loan from my money. I'm lending it to the Meiser Ksafim money. And now I'm going to give the poor person the $20. And then once, and then they give it to the poor. And then once they make a profit, once they get their next paycheck, okay, then they then they pay themselves back from this Meiser money. The language is a little funny. And they basically stipulate that, when I start then getting my next paycheck, I'll take off of that paycheck, till I paid myself back from the Meiser money before I then start contributing new funds to the Meiser money. So this is fascinating, I think, in terms of just giving us a window into conceptually what was happening. And, it's not saying like, at the end of the year, why not just keep a running record of all the money you've given to the poor? And at the end of the year, look and see whether you've given more or less than 10%. And if you've given less than 10%, you'll make up the difference and that'll be your Meiser. That's not what the practice was. The practice here, and we know this is true even till today, I certainly in like yeshivish communities, some people actually have a separate bank account. And every time they get a check, they make a profit, whether it's a paycheck or whatever, or in business, they take 10% and they deposit it into that bank account. And that's their Meiser Ksafim bank account. And I should say that is very powerful at a religious level. This idea of saying that I got this from God, and therefore I want to recognize that from the very outset. Like Yaakov says, everything you gave me, I will give a tenth back to you. As soon as I get some money, 10%. I know this comes from God, so I'm recognizing that right at the outset, and 10% goes to God. And then it's like, this isn't even my money. This is God's money. This is my Tzedakah. I'm just here to distribute it, okay, to see who it goes to. I mean, that is huge in terms of a religious mentality towards our money, and towards, God's hand in it. And it's not like, oh, look at me, I'm such a wonderful person. I'm giving tzedakah. Like, no, God gave me all of this. I'm recognizing that, giving it back. And now I'm just distributing, this God's money that, God has entrusted me with. So Rabbi, I'm not saying all of that is being said here, but the phenomenon, let me just finish, the phenomenon of that you don't just come at the end of the year or even at the beginning and say, oh, I expect to make X amount. I'm going to try to give X amount this year and I'll figure out my books at the end. That's not the phenomenon. The phenomenon is, as I'm earning money, I put 10% aside. And now I have to deal with the question of, let's say the tzedakah needs right now outstrip the available funds I have in my tzedakah account. And therefore, the practice developed that I can lend money to my tzedakah account and pay myself back. And that's how this would work. Yes, there was a question.
Yes, I have a question. In contemporary times, how does this relate to computing before or after taxes and figuring out how much you're giving to tzedakah? If you were to put 10% aside at each moment that you brought in funds, how would that all compute in the end?
Wait, I'm sorry, say the question one more time.
Yeah, in other words, the question is, do you compute tzedakah, the 10%, before taxes or after taxes?
Oh, so we haven't gotten to that yet. We're getting to that.
But how would that relate to this? How would that relate to this if you kept putting that money in a 10% account?
Oh, I guess you would estimate what if the government withheld taxes, it would make it a lot easier. Then you would give 10% off of your net. Right? Okay. If you were in business and you gave your taxes and you gave your taxes like at the end, right? You'd have to, I guess, sort of like guesstimate, and whatever. You might have to adjust the account, but you would still try to, approximate that. Okay. Yeah. But now he just makes a technical point. He says this idea of like lending and borrowing, you can only do that because this is a minhag. If this money was really money that belonged to the poor people, you can't lend a poor person money and agree to pay them back without involving them in the conversation. But you can do that here because it's not really that they are halachically entitled to the money. This is a minhag, so we allow this type of, I'm going to lend money into the pushka and then I'm going to pay myself back. Okay, and here gets the idea. This meiser that we take from rebit, from interest on loans that we charge. All right. So that's again a classic way in which it was taken. Eino ela minhag, that is only a minhag. Therefore, when you lend money into the tzedakah and you take it back out, you don't have to stipulate with anybody because there's no really other person that's halachically entitled to it. And this gets back to the Tosfos. We connect it to a pasuk, aser to aser, give a tenth. To my ribakol, it sounds like give a tenth of everything, not just your agricultural. So that pasuk is the basis. We know it's not really a halachic obligation, but the fact that the pasuk says give a tenth of everything, that's the motivation why we give a tenth. Therefore, we can that allows us to sort of do this type of lending and stipulating, even though we're not really doing it with the poor people themselves. So what's fascinating about this, both of the two sources we looked at now closely give us a window into the practice, widespread to the poor, acknowledge that it's just a minhag. It's a minhag, but it's backed by a pasuk. The pasuk sort of speaks about the importance of it. And the way it was done was money was set aside and then money was taken from the money that was set aside. Okay? So that's where we are in terms of the background. And now we will turn to looking at how this gets articulated in the poskim, and again with a particular question around, as we've been talking about, around what do you call it? Around net versus gross, and like what type of a use. Are we really going to be stuck with this idea that it's limited to be given to the poor? Because I think that would really impact people's tzedakah giving if Meiser Ksafim was only to the poor. Okay, so let's take a look. The Shulchan Aruch says the following: Shir nitina, okay, how much tzedakah should you give? Im yadomas, I guess this is source 22. If you have the capacity, yitain kifit tzarchanim, give based on what the need is, what the poor need. Im ein yadomas, if you can't satisfy the needs of all the poor, yitain ad chomesh nechasav, mitzah min habuchar. Ideally, you should strive to give 20%. The echad me'asara, if giving 10%, midah beinonit, that would be an average person, how much they should give to tzedakah. Pachod mikan ayin ra'ah. Less than that, you're considered to be stingy. Okay? The chomesh zeh shamru, and then he says, how do you figure out 20%? Is it 20% this ideal? Is that 20% of your income or of your principal? Shana rishana me'akeren. People asked a question of this variation before. The first year, 20% should be your principal, your assets. Afterwards of your income. So Shulchan Aruch, in talking about the mitzvah tzedakah, says technically as an obligation, you don't really. There's no minimum amount. We might call you stingy, but there's no halachic mandate for any minimum, other than if an ani sticks out his hand, then you have to give them something, okay? But as guidelines, so 10% is the average we expect of people, 20% is the ideal we want you to stretch to. So Shulchan Aruch is Sfarad, is not Ashkenaz, and therefore, within Shulchan Aruch, you do not have the institution of Meiser Ksafim. You just have it as a recommended guideline. Okay, your average person should try to give 10%. The Ramah, however, he goes ahead and he recognizes the institution of Maaser. Okay, I'm going to skip the first part of the Ramah, which isn't really relevant for us. Okay, he speaks about how exactly you figure out the fifth. It's another conversation that's a little distracting. Anyway, here's what the Ramah writes. The ein la'asos mi maaser shelo dvar mitzvah. When you take your maaser, you should not use it for a mitzvah, meaning for like giving it to a mikvah, to go neirot lebeit hakneset, or to pay for the shul's electricity bill, or shar dvar mitzvah, or anything else. Rak yitnenu la'aniyim, give it to the poor, based on the earlier Ashkenazi sources. So what you see in the difference between Shulchan Aruch and Ramah is Shulchan Aruch talks about guidelines of, of average, like of percentages, ideal 20%, but an average is 10%. These are, guidelines. These are what you should be trying to hit, but the Ramah talks about an institution of maaser, right? He calls it maaser, a tithe. That is, you do not have it called that way in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says 1 out of 10, 1 out of 5. He's talking about a percentage that maybe should be a hit. So again, we see this difference between Ashkenaz and Sfarad. And now we are going to take a look at different voices about whether we have to limit it to the poor, okay? And the first important voice is that of the Bach, Rabbi Yol Sirkis, 17th century. And here's what he writes. Maaser ani ein notnim mehem l'tzedakah, okay? When we talk about the tithing of the grain, of a tithe to the poor, you have to give it, you can't like redirect it to some other tzedakah obligation that has to go to the poor. Miu ein ze ela maaser ani mizera haaretz. That's only the tithe of the poor that is from what you grow from the ground, the Torah tithing of the poor. Shehi mitzvah aseh min Torah. That is a real obligation of the Torah. Avol ma she'adam aser mimar shemarviach. But the ma'aser that you give from what the profit you make, the masau matan in your business, buying and selling, import and export, kiksafim, v'shar revachim, like in monies, meaning like interest, lending money in interest, and other types of ways of making a profit. Eino bichlal zeh, that is not part of the Torah's idea of meiser, of the meiser. We shouldn't learn it out from the Torah. That's a different thing. That's a minhag. And here here is the first new voice about what you can do it for. So our practice of meiser is not the Torah agricultural gift. This is a minhag. And this minhag, he says, is not limited to the poor. And you can give it to tzedakah or to redeeming captives. It's not biblical, it's not rabbinic. You can go ahead and you can give it to, and here he means like tzedakah written more broadly. Okay, you do not have to give it just to the poor. You can give it to other types of of causes. So we now let's take a pause and write down what we've seen so far, because I feel we need a little bit to catch up. Okay, so what have we seen so far? In the Maharam, we see it's an established custom, established, I should say, widespread custom. Given to poor cannot give to non-poor religious causes. That's what the Maharam said. The Maharil, which is 14th century, said that, what did he say? He said, he speaks about the practice to set aside money into a separate fund. Okay, also only to the poor. Okay, and then we have then we get to the Shulchan Aruch, which is and here the Shulchan Aruch himself says guidelines: 20% ideal, 10% average, less is stingy, but it's all guidelines. No strict obligation of a minimum. Okay, and the Ramah, who's Ashkenaz, speaks about ma'aser, a tithe that is given to the poor. And now we have Bach, who is 17th century, and he says also it's minhag, and therefore can go to tzedakah that is not just the poor. Okay, so we're seeing again the difference of the development of this practice, and a question of whether it is limited to the poor or not limited to the poor. I want to go any questions right now, or should we go on to one or two more sources about where you could direct it? I'll pause for a second. Okay.
Rabbi Linzer,
Yeah.
this is more a structural question perhaps, but what gives the later people the halachic chops, as it were, to overrule what was a previous ruling by the in terms of limiting it to the poor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that because it's a minhag, what somebody who has to do is being able, like a historian, is figure out, always within Psak, the relationship between ruling and practice, and how much is ruling sort of catching up to practice, reflecting practice, or changing practice, right? So given that this was a minhag, even though the sources that are cited as the traditional authoritative voices in Ashkenaz, the Maharam and the Maharil and the Ramah, are saying poor, 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 right? Is it the fact that the Maharam had to say you're not allowed to use it for something else, right, means that it was not already taken for granted that you can't use it for something else. And therefore, one imagines in the widespread reaches of Ashkenazi Jewry, it was not completely uniform, and that there were places also that did use it for other things. So I don't think that what the Bach is doing is he's coming along and saying, I know everybody thinks it absolutely has to be in the Bor, but I'm going to advocate that we use it for other things. But I think that this was probably something that there were some gray areas and some questions. So even though the voices that I've shown were the ones that were insisting the poor, that doesn't mean that those, but I guess the point is, do we have earlier voices that said, not just before the 17th century? I'd have to look that up. Okay, but I don't think they're talking in a vacuum is my short answer. Yeah, Henry. Henry Krause, you have your hand up? No?
Yeah, it seems that we've evolved into giving tzedakah for a community use in Pidyon Hashvuyim. Now, so that's a major difference than giving it to the poor, unless you consider the people who are held captive poor people.
Right. So it is a major difference. I mean, there are definitely people in dire need, but that is not the classic use of giving to the poor. They might be wealthy people that are being held as captive because people are hoping that people will redeem them and give, cough up a lot of serious money. So that is correct, that is exactly why you are now having a voice, that it is not that narrow and not that limited to that. I should also say, and this was something I failed to mention before, I cut out a little too much of the text here, but the question becomes, and this is going to be the issue about paying my kids' tuition, can I use the money to pay something that, is it only like my discretionary tzedakah, spending is Meiser Ksafim, or can I even use it to pay things that I have a prior obligation to? If there is a mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, then everybody has an obligation to participate in that. So maybe I can my Meiser can only go to things that are totally discretionary spending, and the obligatory things like my kid's tuition, because I have to educate my kid, that's a halacha, I have to give my kid a Torah education, other things that are like obligatory tzedakah obligations cannot be paid with Meiser money. That is a very important question, and that gets to the question of, can I count tuition towards Meiser? If you can count tuition towards Meiser, then most people won't have to pay Meiser for a long time. Okay, so that's also part of what the Bach is discussing. The Bach is opening up a lot of possibilities, all right? We can skip source 25. Source 25 just points out that there were posting that thought...
Rabbi Linzer,
sure.
Rabbi Linzer, as a follow-up, on that, I know that communities are obligated to, each community has to have what we refer to here in West Texas as the shul, the pool, and the school.
Okay.
And so the question is, if each community is obligated to establish these things, then certainly that counts, towards obligatory, there's an obligatory nature of it. It's not just simply, of giving to institutions. It has more force than, the minhag sort of thing, doesn't it? I'm asking.
Does community obligations have more force than minhag? I mean,
Yeah,
are you asking halachically? Are you asking psychologically?
Halachically.
I mean, look, in the past, communal obligations were enforced because we had self-governance and we were able to enforce them, through through the people that were the political leaders of the Jewish community, when Jews had like their own self-governing communities. So they were enforced because they were enforced, and it's certainly true that we have internalized a very powerful sense of communal obligation. There's a lot of communal pressure that creates that obligation. Whether it creates a halachic obligation, I don't think you could say in it of itself, like if this is the practice in the community, then it could become a type of a minhag. But communal pressure is, it's communal pressure, and it could sometimes be a really good thing, and it makes people, participate. But I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. I don't think the fact that if the community decides to create certain obligations and so on, does that become halachically obligatory? No, but it could develop into a minhag, into the source of minhag.
It's just, again, the obligation to build a shul, a mikveh,
Oh,
and
oh, is that
there
what you
is
were asking? I'm sorry, I
yes,
misunderstood your question.
right.
Yes,
In other words,
yes, I'm sorry.
community says that you are. I don't know where that comes from. Okay, where
Yeah.
does it come from that a community is obligated to have a mikveh, to have a
Oh, okay.
school?
I'm sorry. I was not focused in on the question. No, you are absolutely correct. There is a definite communal obligation. The Gemara talks about communal obligations around school and shul and mikvah and all of those things. And there are tshuvas of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which comes first, the shul or the mikvah. Rav Moshe says the mikvah comes before the shul, and a school that goes way back. So yes, there are communal obligations to create these institutions. So you are right that there is that communal obligation would make certain demands that if we don't have a school or a shul, everybody has to contribute to make sure, based on their ability to contribute, to make sure it gets built. That does not translate into a communal obligation to pay the rabbi's salary or to pay the electric bills, right? Or so that so that's where you have to start talking about
But even that, what is the use of having a yeshiva building if you don't have rabbeim? And
right. So in the yeshiva context, it's not about the building. In the yeshiva context, it's about you have to provide the funds to support the education. So yes, in the yeshiva context, there is a communal responsibility to have a school. And actually, I should say, and this is a whole separate conversation, it's not about people paying their own personal tuition. It's about the entire community supporting free education for everyone. That is what you have in the Gemara. Okay, and that's not about the building at all. Okay, in terms of the shul and the school, the shul and the mikveh, though, I mean, it doesn't translate fully in those cases into the ongoing into all of the ongoing expenses. But you're right to raise it, meaning yes, there is a degree of obligation in terms of school. Definitely, we do not do that. We have people pay per tuition based on their number of kids, and then we give scholarships, etc. We do not have free tuition that everybody is taxed equally as a community, right? That we don't have that in the Jewish context, although that's what the Gemara talks about. And in the shul, the sense of obligation in the shul is a little bit less. It is less than the obligation of the school, and it certainly does not translate into youth groups and the rabbi salary and the electric. So that is not a strict obligation from the Gemara, and
and that would all count towards the concept of maser sofim.
Assuming you can use Meiser Ksufim for non-poor people purposes, right, then yes, because then that gets back to the point, right? A, can it be used for not poor, and B, can it be used for pre-existing obligations? So if you're telling me the shul is both, I'm not technically obligated to pay for the rabbi's salary as a technical halachic matter, and B, it's okay to use it for the non-poor, then it's good. If you're telling me I am obligated to pay for the rabbi's salary, then I can't use my Meiser Ksufim money for it. All right, I think we might have lost some people. I'll try to get back and summarize that. Let me just say the following, okay? Here's another source. We're a little running out of time, not a surprise. Here's another source, 17th century Prague, Shvus Yaakov, who spends the whole tshuva saying, it's interesting, that there was a widespread understanding in a lot of poskim that this really was a biblical or rabbinic obligation. It had become so internalized that people really believed it was so obligatory that it was really understood as a type of a biblical or rabbinic obligation. And later poskim had to come and say, no, you're not reading the sources properly. This is really just a minhag. Okay, and the reason that that's important is that when it's a minhag, it gives us more flexibility. So if we take a look here at the end of this, it says the following. Elavadai, here, I'll read here. Rather, I'll just read it in the English. Okay, rather, there is no technical obligation here, not even a rabbinic one. And therefore, it is not accepted practice in all places. So that a little bit gets back to you, Bert, about how can some people say you can only use it for the poor and other people say not that way? Because the practice was not uniform. Not only where you used it, but it wasn't even uniform that everybody did it. okay? However, in places where the practice is spread, or regarding someone who wants to be strict on himself and practices the custom, for such a person, his intent is clearly that the money be used strictly for Meiser Ani purposes. So he says, look, on the one hand, it's true. It's only a minhag. On the other hand, he says, for those who do the minhag, I am going to assume that they are building it off of the model of Meiser Ani, of tithing to the poor. Thus, Ramah rules that one cannot use it for a mitzvah purpose, like candles. Rather, it must be given to the poor. It's possible it's become like a vow to treat it as Meiser Ani, and would be forgetting to use it to pay off other mitzvah debts. So there's the question also of other debts. So what you have now in the poskim is the following question, okay? You have some want to, some insist on the Maaser Ani, poor tithe, as the model, even if it is just a minhag, okay? You know, okay, here, let's hear now, okay, hold on. Okay, hold on. Let's call this something else. Okay, hold on, oh, sorry. Yeah. What can it be used for? And can you use it for existing tzedakah obligations? Okay, so that gets back to the question that Bert was asking, e.g., let's say tuition, because you have a mitzvah to educate your children. Okay, can you use it for existing obligations? Okay, tasteful tuition. Okay, so now that is the two big questions that we are asking. What can it be used for? And what about existing obligations? Can it be used for existing obligations? Okay, so for that, some insist on the Meiser Ani model. And the Meiser Ani model means, and that means, therefore, only the poor and not pre-existing obligations. As opposed to others, okay, this would be this was, who did we just read? I think it was Yaakov. Used for non-poor and for pre-existing obligations, not via Maaser. Okay, so there is a whole question about, do we want to insist on a Meiser Ani model, which would have very limiting type of implications. Maaser Ani model. Okay, that is the question. All right, is this a lot, or are people with me here? Okay, we see that it was an established practice. We hear from later sources. I should write here. We hear from later sources that it was not practiced in all places. Okay, so we see that it was an established practice, that money was given into a separate fund. We see that it is not, Shulchan Aruch does not know of it. Sfardim do not know of it as a institution. The Ramah does speak about it as a tithe, okay? And that leads here, let's take this out, to the important question of, what is the model? Are we going to limit ourselves to a Maaser Ani model, or said in other way, what can it be used for? Okay, can you use it? Can it be used for, just poor or other? And can it be used for pre-existing tzedakah obligations? And there we have a debate. If you insist on the Meiser Ani model, it can only be used for the poor, and it cannot be used for pre-existing obligations. And if you don't insist on that model, you have a lot more flexibility. So not surprisingly, it is already 12:30, and we have so much that we have not covered, okay?
Rabbi Linzer,
yes.
Rabbi Linzer, why don't we sort of, I'll send you some notes that I have about some of the questions that remained open, like Lance's question about giving to non-Orthodox communities, which
Right.
leads us, to what, to non-Orthodox institutions rather, or non-Orthodox institutions. And that leads something to which I know you've given a share previously on what constitutes communities in terms of circles of obligation,
Right.
to get to tzedakah. So, since it's 12:31 now and stuff like that, maybe what we should do is just leave this for another occasion, and you'll pick up with another series of, on tzedakah.
Yeah, I feel
tzedakah
bad. I was
part two.
hoping to get more done this time, and so I know there's a lot of unanswered questions. It was important for me to show that how this, these questions ultimately developed from the question of how much of an obligation is this really, and if it's only a minhag, does that give us more flexibility? And if it is a minhag, though, maybe we should be limited to an idea of the tithe of the poor. No, does it? Why should we limit ourselves? We should have more opportunity. And that the two big questions that were asked were what types of purposes can it be go towards, and whether it can pay existing obligations. I do want to end by saying, since we did not get a chance, there's obviously a lot more material, but I do want to actually answer one big question that was asked about gross versus net and about taxes. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, if people give me 2 more minutes, just to say this one important point, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that the practice was always on essentially your take-home pay, like on your net. Okay, and therefore taxes that are taken like from the paycheck, if you're on a salary, from before you even see the money, he says that would not be included in the Meiser Ksafim. It's only the take home. That's what he claims. And if you look at Rav Moshe's tshuvas on it, Rav Moshe very much is in this process of adopts this idea of what I call halachicizing it, of saying, like, can you use it for this? He was asked the question here. I'll tell you an example of a question he was asked. I know you can't use it to pay boys' tuition because that's a pre-existing stuck obligation because we have to teach our sons Torah. But can I use it to pay my daughter's day school tuition? Since I don't have a mitzvah to teach daughters Torah, so that's on a pre-existing tzedakah obligation, and therefore I should be able to use it for that. To which Rav Moshe Feinstein said, I'm not sure you'll all like this answer. He said, you might not have an obligation to teach them Torah, but you have an obligation to keep them frum. And since the only way you're going to keep them frum is by sending them to a Jewish day school, it is a pre-existing obligation, and therefore you can't use your Meiser Ksafim for that money. Okay. So anyway, in the post game, you get all of these types of questions of net or gross, only to the poor, for other people, pre-existing, non-pre-existing, all of those questions. I tend to advise people to follow the approach of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rev Waldenberg. And what Rev Waldenberg says is, he says, look, this is a minhag. And since it's a minhag, as opposed to some of those arguments that try to over-halachacize it, he says, since this is a minhag, there's a lot of latitude about how you want to practice this. So what I say to people is, figure out a model that works for you now, where you are in life, in terms of what your level of income is, what your your financial responsibilities and so on. Try to do a model that stretches you a little, like something that's not too easy, but maybe like, do you want to first do it after you've paid for your mortgage and after you've paid for your, this and your car insurance and all of that? Like, where do you draw the line between, between gross and net? If I do it after I pay for all my outstanding obligations, I'm going to be left with $100, a month that I can, whatever. Is that what it should be? So there's a lot of latitude. Figure out something that makes sense for you, and something that like would stretch you, in a reasonable way, given your current reality. And in terms of like, what can you use it for? It might be technically you can use it for your kids' tuition and your shul dues, but then you won't be doing anything beyond that. And again, if you absolutely have no money, maybe, but figure out the answer to these questions, not based on some model like Meiser Ani, but based on the realities of your life. figure out a system that works for you in terms of the gross and the net and which expenses, in terms of your kids' tuition and the show and so on, and use that model and go by it and be consistent with it. And then, every few years, like, revisit it. Does it still make sense to be using this model? Or should I, now, thank God, I have a lot more available income or this or that? That's sort of what I advise people.
Rabbi Linzer, Moshe Levison has his
Yes,
hand up,
Moshe,
if you
we'll
don't
end
mind.
with your question, but I just wanted to make, to sort of, to end at least with something practical, that you should be aware that all the questions that you asked are discussed in the postscript. There's a lot of different opinions. And as opposed to Rav Moshe that really does this with a more formal halachic approach, my approach is to say, look at the different models that exist and adopt one that works for you, and then reassess it every couple of years. That's my basic approach. Moshe, last point by Moshe Levinson.
I feel honored. My question really was, I was thinking about people who get money from the government for SNAP or for their children. Is that considered money that you would take money out of?
Yeah, so Rav Moshe was actually asked that there was somebody who was a yeshiva student, and he was given money by his father-in-law to sit and to learn and to whatever, and he asked Rav Moshe if he has to give Meiser Ksafim off of that money, and and Rav Moshe said that he did. Now, what you should do is you should knock on your next door neighbor's house and you should swap your Meiser Ksafims, So that might be a way to do it. I think that it's a good question because on the one hand, right, the idea that even if I am receiving, support from others and tzedakah from others, to have the ability to give tzedakah is extremely empowering to me. It means that I am not just somebody that is, dependent on others and just like a schnorrer. I'm actually somebody that can give tzedakah to other people. So I actually think that there is something hugely powerful for saying that even somebody receiving assistance should give Meiser Ksafim. The challenge with it, of course, is like, how does the father-in-law feel? Here I am giving, giving you this money, and you're going at, and I'm trying to support you, and you're going at, and you're turning around and giving it away to, when you need it to help put food on the table for my grandkids. So it's again, it's one of those things that does not have a black and white answer, but I do recognize, even though I could imagine the father-in-law or the government not being thrilled, well, I don't know if the government cares, but anyway, thrilled with the answer. I see something very dignifying and empowering with the answer that even somebody receiving tzedakah should be giving Meiser Ksafim as well.
So kest can count.
So what?
Kest can count.
Yes.
So can you put the Tzitz Eliezer, in your your sheet? So when you send me the sheet, that'll.
You mean in the notes?
In the notes, yes.
In the
please.
notes. Maybe if people want to wait here, just literally one more second, I can read.
Sure.
Anybody who wants to stay, we can read the Tzitz Eliezer together. Here, let me find it.
Does he have a source sheet that he circulated, or it's just?
Yeah, I think he did. I actually need to send it to you.
Yeah, I do.
I have a question.
Wait. Hold on.
It's all really interesting stuff.
It is, yeah. Very compelling.
But I have a little bit of a problem in terms of,
Here we go. Okay, we'll end by this. Okay, I'm going to read this source. This is, I think, the good source to end with. Meiser Ksafim from profit. Is this after one deducts household expenses and what's included in household expenses? There you go. The question everybody wanted was asking, right? So he goes through his whole analysis, and here's how he ends. And thus I will conclude and say that since, as I've explained, the opinion of the majority of decisors is Meiser Ksafim is only rabbinic, it's not even rabbinic, and many hold that it's no more than custom. Therefore, one who wishes to accept upon himself to separate Meiser can certainly do so, but should adopt the practice according to the opinion that one takes Meiser from the profit after they're deducted. Household expenses include everything that one needs without any compromise or limitations. And this will be a good fulfillment of Meiser Ksafim. So do it after you've paid all your expenses, your rent, your utility, your food, your everything. Focus on the money afterwards. That is a way that everybody can do Meiser Ksafim. If you start focusing on it after you've deducted all of your expenses. So, but the larger point that I take from this is, once it's a minhag, you can decide what way you want to adopt it. All right. So, and as I say, I wouldn't adopt it in the easiest way. I would adopt it in the best way, in the way that works for you, where you are in life and so on. And these different questions of after expenses or before expenses, or what type of tzedakah and pre-existing tzedakahs, obligations, not pre-existing obligations, pick a model that works for you, and then every few years reassess it. Okay, and with that, I really follow the Tzitz Eliezer.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been wonderful.
Okay, I'm so glad. All right, to be continued. Take
Yes.
care,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So.
So can